Week 6 of the fantasy football season. Here's wide receiver starts at every matchup. This week, Thursday night division matchup, the NFC East rivals Philadelphia Eagles at the New York Giants. A.J. Brown, it's been a very down year for him. Only one game in the first 5 with double-digit fantasy points. But this week, if it was any week he would get right, it's at the New York Giants. And if he don't, then he's definitely someone to consider to put on your bench is A.J. Brown. But like I said, this New York Giant defense can't stop anyone. If it's any week to get going, it'll be this week. And I think they're going to set a tone early, Jalen Hurts, to get a point across to get the football to A.J. Brown. Devonta Smith to start. Last week, he went over 100 yards in a tough loss versus a good Denver Bronco defense was Devonta Smith. And I think him and Hurts are back on the same page. And like I said, with an easy matchup, both these wide receivers could go out there, especially on Thursday night where it's usually high-scoring games, and put up numbers. Darius Slayton, he left the game last week at the Saints with a hamstring injury. We don't know if he's going to play in this ball game, but even if he does, he's not a start, and Wan'Dale Robinson not a start as well. This week with almost a full slate, Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson in your 10, 12-team leagues, not going to be wide receivers you're going to count on. And this Giant offense has pretty much been a run-first offense. Even in the games that trail, we know Jackson Dart's looking to run a lot, and right now, arguably, Theo Johnson's the number one option in this passing attack. Then Broncos, New York Jets, London ball game, Cortland Sutton to start each and every week. And the Jets, they just can't stop anyone, especially number one wide receivers over the last few weeks. We saw Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill have good ball games in week 4. We saw last week George Pickens have a nice game, scoring a touchdown, and Ryan Flournoy coming out of nowhere over 100 yards. So this week, once again, if it's Sauce Gardner on him half the game or not, I don't think it matters. When Sutton goes out there, has a good game. Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims are sit. These wide receivers had a couple pop games here and there, but not consistent. And also, this offense is a run-first type of offense at times. You know, Bo Nix, he's mobile. Got J.K. Dobbins, got R.J. Harvey out of the backfield at times. And like I said, even in a good matchup, Franklin and Mims, not two wide receivers you would trust. Garrett Wilson locked in weekly as a starter, and he just finds ways to put fantasy points on the board, even if it's garbage time, which obviously plays in his favor and the Jets' favor. He's going to put points on the board. So this week, no doubt about it, a tough matchup. Most likely Patrick Surtain, one of the best corners in the league, going to be shadowing Wilson in this one. But still, Wilson just finds a way, it seems like, weekly to get points. Seattle Seahawks at the Jaguars. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he's a top 5 option weekly. Him and Sam Darnold have a great rapport going. Yards after catch, obviously one of the best wide receivers and route runners in the league. And this week, even though Jacksonville's playing great football and they're holding teams down more times than not, JSN an easy start. Cooper Kupp, Torrey Horton, both sits in this one. Cooper Kupp will have a couple good games here and there, like last week, 6 catches, 59 yards. That's a decent PPR game, but touchdown upside isn't there. Targets aren't there like they were obviously in Los Angeles, and he's at the latter part now of his career. Is Cooper Kupp, where he definitely lost a step, unfortunately. He's a sit. And Torrey Horton, we know he's a return man and a touchdown-dependent number 3 wide receiver on the Seahawks team. So this week he's a sit because if he don't score a touchdown, he has no value. Brian Thomas Jr. start. Last couple weeks he's starting to get things going a little bit. Big victory Monday night versus the Chiefs, it was in week 5. And he had a big 33-yard catch in the game-winning drive. Boys, Brian Thomas Jr. And also a big passing interference he caused as well in the back of the end zone to tee it up for them. So this week in a matchup where it could be potential high scoring, where we saw Seattle just give up 38 points to the Bucs, he's a start. Travis Hunter, he's playing 50-50 pretty much. That's what we saw last game versus Chiefs. 40 snaps on D, 40 snaps on offense, and that's just tough to trust. I know he came down with a nice 42-yard leap and grab was Travis Hunter in that game, but like I said, if he's going to play both sides of the ball, and in this one they'll probably play him on defense with JSN over there to get a few snaps on him. Just upside's going to be capped this week, where he's pretty much on a snap count. De'Ami Brown a sit, solid number 3 wide receiver, but not really fantasy value week in and week out. And inconsistent is De'Ami Brown. Los Angeles Chargers at the Dolphins. I like all 3 wide receivers in this Charger offense. Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston. McConkey finally found the end zone last week. We'll see if he can keep it going versus the depleted and bad secondary of the Dolphins. Keenan Allen, last couple weeks, numbers have dropped off a little bit, but the targets are still there. Him and Herbert are locked in. And Keenan Allen, he's a guy, I think, as long as he's healthy, will be a steady player the remainder of the season. And Quentin Johnston, one bad game it was for him last week versus the Commanders. But I just think this week, with Amari and Hampton obviously out 4 games minimum on IR with the ankle injury, and a good matchup at the Dolphins, I think they throw the football a whole lot, is this Charger team. And these 3 wide receivers get their numbers. Jalen Waddle will start. Now the number 1 receiver now on this roster, with Tyreek Hill obviously out for the season. And last week, he had a big ball game at the Carolina Panthers, over 100 yards, and found the end zone. So this week versus a leaky secondary of the Chargers, he's a start. Malik Washington is it. Last week he had 4 catches for no yards. He's a gadget guy, not much of a guy that's going to line up, be a traditional wide receiver, and not a great route runner is Washington. So I know a lot of people went to the wire last week and picked him up, but right now, easy sit. Puka Angeles Rams at the Ravens. Puka Nacua with Devontae Adams, weekly their starts. Arguably the best 2 wide receiver combo in the league. And Puka Nacua, he's on pace for almost 2,000 yards this season. So this week, at a battered and banged up secondary of Baltimore with no one left, I think he goes out there, has a monster game again. And Devontae Adams, double-digit fantasy points every week. Obviously, you want to see a little bit more, but it's tough to get some monster games when you're playing alongside Puka Nacua. But Adams, as a receiver, too, for fantasy owners, very solid. Zay Flowers a start. And then Mark Andrews, pretty much the only guys you could trust in this passing game. Last week, I thought he had an okay game with Cooper Rush in their quarterback with Zay Flowers. So this week in a matchup where it could be high scoring between these teams somehow, or a game they're chasing points, Flowers will get decent numbers. Rashad Bateman, DeAndre Hopkins is it. Bateman, he hasn't done much of the season. Last season, that was a good year for him. Hopkins has been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver. So with Cooper Rush in their quarterback, it's not a guy really could trust. He's a sit. Arizona Cardinals at the Colts, Marvin Harrison to start. His numbers the last couple weeks have been better for Harrison, but I still feel like it's not going to be consistent week in and week out. And now Kyler Murray's banged up a little bit as well, and we'll see if he plays in this game, even though I think he should. Is Kyler Murray came back in last week's ball game in a tough loss versus Tennessee. So Marvin, like I said, double-digit fantasy games 2 weeks in a row. I'll put him out there with Indianapolis. Michael Pittman to start. Coming into the year, no ceiling it was for Michael Pittman, but just with a quarterback change going to Daniel Jones, obviously making a huge difference. So this week in a matchup versus a pretty bad secondary, he's a start. Josh Downs of City finally came on the last week, 6 catches, 54 yards it was for Josh Downs, but not a guy I could count on week in and week out, especially with Jonathan Taylor there, Pittman and Warren. He's pretty much the 4th option at best. He's a sit. Dallas Cowboys at the Panthers. Looks like CeeDee Lamb most likely miss at least one more game for this Dallas Cowboy team. And George Pickens, he stepped up. Big ball game he had in week 4 versus the Packers. And then week 5, a little quiet of a game, but a nice 43-yard touchdown in the end zone diving grab. So this week at Carolina, a defense that can't stop anyone, he's a start. Jalen Tolbert is sit. He had no points last week, only 1 target. And Ryan Flournoy was the wide receiver that broke out for Dallas. 6 catches, 114 yards. So him and Dak had good rapport. I mentioned him as an ad this week on the waiver wire, but obviously I got to see way more out of him before you put him in a lineup. Ted McMillan, he's a start each and every week. He's had double-digit fantasy points 4 out of 5 games. Cowboys secondary's not good with the Ron Bland, Stephon Diggs, and I think McMillan could be in for his biggest game of the year. Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker, this sits in this one. I know Legette found the end zone last week, but his upside really hasn't been there, and he's arguably a bust already, Xavier Legette. So this week is it. Coker possibly activated this week off the IR, and they can need help, obviously, in the passing game is this Carolina Panther team. So this week, Coker, they'll most likely ease him in. He'll most likely be on a snap count, and even in a good matchup, he's a sit. New England Patriots at the Saints. Stephon Diggs, the last 2 weeks, he's really come on, and maybe he's finally got his legs on the rim after coming off an ACL tear last season, where week 8 he was out, and he was ready week 1 with Stephon Diggs. So he had obviously a lot of juices flowing and a lot of anger towards the Buffalo Bills, it seemed like, the Stephon Diggs. And he went out there with a monster game in the upset victory, 10 for 146. So this week in a great matchup at the Saints, he's a great start. Keyshawn Boutte, he's a sit. He's had a couple good games here and there. Last week, a few key grabs down the stretch in that game, but only 3 catches, 43 yards. And this offense is Stephon Diggs, Hunter Henry, and the running backs over there for this New England Patriot team. So he's a sit. Chris Olave, a start. He's getting peppered with targets week in and week out is Olave, and pretty much 10, 12 fantasy points at worst you're going to get from Olave, even though I don't think the ceiling's that high where he's a 20-point guy at times is Olave, but this week in a matchup versus New England, it's going to be tough, no doubt about it. But I still think Olave could go out there and have a decent game. Rashid Shaheed, a fringe option. I know last week he went over 100 yards and got a touchdown, but most of that was on an 87-yard touchdown for Shaheed. So we know he's got game-breaking ability, game-breaking speed. But this week versus a pretty stout defense of the Patriots, he's a fringe option at best. Cleveland Browns at the Steelers, Jerry Jeudy a sit. He's done nothing all season long. Last week didn't do much in Dylan Gabriel's first start. And this week in a tough matchup at the Steelers, it's a no-brainer. Isaiah Bond a sit as well. Last week he led the team in targets, which was a good thing for Isaiah Bond, but he didn't do much on the field. And it's going to be growing pains for most of these young guys over there in Cleveland. But besides Harold Fannin Jr. and Junkins, everyone else hasn't really done much. These second, third-year guys and rookies for Cleveland. Now to the Steelers, Calvin Austin banged up, so DK Metcalf, the only wide receiver I listed on here. Metcalf, we saw a big game out of him overseas a couple weeks ago. We had an 80-yard touchdown in that ball game was Metcalf. So Metcalf and Rodgers, they're locked in. They're on the same page. I know ceiling's capped a little bit as Metcalf, and he's a touchdown dependable wide receiver at times. But this week, even in a tougher matchup, will most likely Denzel Ward on him a majority of the game. I would give him the start. Like I said, there's not much going on in that passing game in Pittsburgh. Tennessee Titans at the Raiders. Calvin Ridley, a fringe option. Last week, finally had the breakout game over 120 yards was Calvin Ridley. And this week, it's another good matchup for Ridley and the Titans. But the first 4 weeks of the season, we saw nothing from him. And he's just been an inconsistent wideout, so at best, he's a fringe option. A.O. Maynor got a couple good games early on in the season, but the last couple weeks, he's failed to reach 5 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So this week, even in a good matchup at the Raiders, can't trust A.O. Maynor. Jacoby Myers a start. Last 3 weeks has been rough for him. He's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. And even last week, you thought the numbers would go up a little bit with Brock Bowers out of the lineup. So Brock Bowers week to week, we'll see if he plays in this ball game versus the Titans. But Myers, I think he's doing. This week he's a start. Trey Tucker, a fringe option. Thought he had a decent game last week with Trey Tucker. And he's the number 2 wide receiver easily on this Vegas Raider team. So this week with a decent matchup, even though I don't think the upside is that high for Tucker, even though we saw a 3-touchdown game early in the season, he's a fringe option. 49ers at the Bucs, this could be a mini high-scoring game. Ricky Pearsall, Jawan Jennings, if they play in this one's the starts for me. Obviously, they're 2 top wide receivers over there for the San Francisco 49er team. And Kendrick Bourne, if those guys are out or one of them are out, he's a fringe option. We saw the big game for Bourne last week. 142 yards receiving. Him and Mac Jones were locked in. And obviously that's playing with the second unit in practice with these 2 guys is why they had the rapport. So Bourne, if one of those receivers or both of them are out, he's a fringe option. And Demarcus Robinson a sit last week. It was a golden opportunity. Starting in the lineup, it was for Demarcus Robinson. It's in his former team in the Los Angeles Rams, but he just didn't do much in that ball game. So this week a sit. Bucs, Emeka Egbuka must start. Rookie taking the league by storm already the first 5 weeks of the season. And even if Mike Evans comes back and they're all in the lineup, Evans, Godwin, and Egbuka, there's no stopping Egbuka. This guy's got the breakaway speed. First route runner in his rookie season. And this week, versus a secondary that's middle of the pack of San Francisco, I think he goes out there once again and has his way. Chris Godwin, a fringe option. It's going to take him some time for Chris Godwin after the bad injury last season. I'm surprised he even returned in week 4 was Chris Godwin, so that was good to see from him. But like I said, they're going to take their time with him. It's going to take him time to get into football shape. He's under him. And also the recovery period as well, coming off an injury like he did after these games. Cincinnati Bengals at the Green Bay Packers. Jamar Chase locked in as a start. Last week it was a big ball game for Chase finally with Jake Browning at quarterback, even though they lost. But Jamar Chase, he's a talented wide receiver, obviously, and he could overcome the quarterback changes with Joe Burrow out, obviously, pretty much the whole year so far. T. Higgins a sit. I know he found the end zone last week. That was garbage time for T. Higgins, and pretty much the numbers have been non-existent for him with Jake Browning in running quarterback. And this week in a tough matchup at arguably the best defense in the league at Green Bay, he's a sit. Romeo Doubs, Matthew Golden, both starts for me in this one. Romeo Doubs coming off the big game before the bye with 3 touchdowns. at the Dallas Cowboys. And I think he's the number one wide receiver right now for this Green Bay Packers team. And Matthew Golden, he had a good ball game as well in Week 4 at the Dallas Cowboys. Even though that's not saying much, that defense can't stop anyone. But coming out of bye weeks, we've seen throughout the NFL, especially the last few seasons, rookies get into the playbook more in the bye week, in the field more, and that's where a breakout really could happen. But this week, like I said, Matthew Golden is a start, but it could be a breakout possibly ball game coming off the bye matchup versus a bad Cincinnati defense. Detroit Lions at the Chiefs here. A lot of people thought last season this could have been the Super Bowl matchup, but obviously it was the Eagles and the Chiefs. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's locked in weekly as a starter, one of the best wide receivers in the league. And he's just a guy, you could count on him, 15, 20 points minimum weekly. Jameson Williams is it. I've said this in videos. He's pretty much a deep ball threat and nothing is JMO. And when he's not getting that deep ball or in space and yard after catch prowess, he's been non-existent, so he's a sit. Xavier Worthy a start. Last week he got banged up in the ball game, and before the ball game he almost didn't give it a go. But Xavier Worthy, they're finding ways to get him the football, end arounds, even quick bubble screens, stuff like that. And I thought he had a decent ball game on Monday night in the tough loss versus the Jaguars. And we know Rashee Rice, he's not returning this week. I believe Week 7 he'll be back in the lineup is Rashee Rice. But Xavier Worthy a start. Hollywood Brown, Tyquan Thornton a sit. It's not enough targets going their ways. And pretty much if those guys aren't finding the end zone, they're not really threats. Tyquan Thornton, a lot of speed, no doubt about it. He's the deep ball threat for Patrick Mahomes, but the numbers have to be there consistently. Buffalo Bills at the Atlanta Falcons, the first 2 Monday nights, Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman to start. Shakir, arguably the number one wide receiver on this roster for Buffalo. Good hands, good possession wide receiver, and a good matchup at this Falcon team. And Keon Coleman, he's a touchdown-pending wide receiver, but he's a guy in his second season is Keon Coleman, and I think he's going to start figuring things out. And after coming off a bad loss last week in the Patriots, coming into Buffalo and winning, I think Josh Allen gets these guys the ball early and often, and they have a good ball game. Drake London to start. Drake London, he's been slow out of the gate. The majority of the games this season is London. But Michael Penix, obviously, that's a lot on him, where he's not getting the ball in the right places and making the right reads. So this week in a matchup where they could be chasing points, I like London. Darnell Mooney a sit. Mooney definitely someone that should be rostered in all 10, 12-team leagues is Mooney, but he's been inconsistent. Like I said, with this offense with Michael Penix, besides Bijan Robinson, everyone else, every week it's something different than numbers. And the final game, Chicago Bears at the Commanders. Rome Odunze, he's off to a roaring start in the first month of the season as Odunze, making all the plays, finding the end zone. 4 touchdowns are ready for him. And this week, it's a beatable matchup, and obviously he's a start at the Commanders. DJ Moore start as well. I know the numbers haven't been great for DJ Moore, but when you count him out, these times when we've seen DJ Moore go out there and have some games. So this week, in a matchup where it could be a potential high scorer on Monday night, he's a start. Luther Burden is it. Definitely someone to keep an eye on is Burden, because the bye week passed last week, obviously, for this Bear team, and that's when these rookies get more opportunity and obviously into the playbook more. And now to the Commanders, Deebo Samuel will start. I've said this a lot in my videos, like a broken record. Taking those first receiver reps in training camp definitely helped them build rapport with Jaden Daniels. And once again, in Week 5, he had a big touchdown to close it out at the Chargers. Was Deebo Samuel in the back of the end zone. So this week he's an easy start versus a bad defense. And Terry McLaurin, if he plays, I would give him the nod. So Scary Terry got his contract. Obviously he didn't do training camp, and now with ready injuries catching up to McLaurin in the first season of the deal. See if he heals and could play Monday night's ball game. That's wide receiver starts in every matchup for Week 6 of the fantasy football season.